Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Rice, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for all your service presently and in the past to your country. As you know, our task is to assemble facts in order to inform ourselves and then ultimately to inform the American public of the causes of this horrible event, and also to make recommendations to mitigate against the possibility that there'll ever be another terrorist triumph on our homeland or against our people. And as we do this with the aid of testimony of people like yourself, of course there will be some discrepancies, as there always will, and we will have to try as best we can to resolve those discrepancies. And obviously that's an important thing for us to do. But as important as that ultimately may be, it also is our responsibility to really come up with ways and valid ways to prevent another intelligence failure like we've suffered. And I don't think anybody will kid ourselves that we didn't suffer one. So we must try to look at the systems and the policies that were in place and to evaluate them and to see, getting a view of the landscape, and I know it's difficult to do it through a pre-9/11 lens, but we must try to do that so that we can do better the next time. And I'd like to follow up with a couple of areas in that sort of specificity. And one is the one that you were just discussing with Commissioner Benvenisti. We've all heard over the years the problem between the CIA, the FBI, coordination, et cetera. And you made reference to an introduction you'd done to a book, but you also, in October of 2000, while you were part of the campaign team for the candidate Bush, you told a radio station, WJR, which is in Detroit, and you're talking about the threat and how to deal with al-Qaeda. And if I may quote, you said, you were discussing Osama bin Laden. The first is you really have to get intelligence agencies better organized to deal with the terrorist threat to the United States itself. One of the problems that we have is kind of a split responsibility, of course, between the CIA and foreign intelligence and the FBI and domestic intelligence. There needs to be better cooperation because we don't want to wake up one day and find that Osama bin Laden has been successful on our territory. End of your quote. Well, in fact, sadly, we did wake up, and that did happen. And obviously, there is a systemic problem. And what I really like you to address right now is what steps were taken by you and the administration, to your knowledge, in the first several months of the administration to assess and address this problem.
Well, thank you. We did have a structural problem, and structural problems take some time to address. We did have a national security policy directive asking the CIA through the Foreign Intelligence Board, headed by Brent Scowcroft, to review its intelligence activities, the way that it gathered intelligence, and that was a study that was to be completed. The Vice President was a little later, I think in May, tasked by the President to put together a group to look at all of the recommendations that had been made about domestic preparedness and all of the questions associated with that, to take the Gilmore report and the Hart-Rudman report and so forth, and to try to make recommendations about what might have been done. We were in office 233 days, and the kinds of structural changes that have been needed by this country for some time did not get made in that period of time. I'm told that after the Millennium Plot was discovered, that there was an after-action report done and that some steps were taken. To my recollection, that was not briefed to us during the transition period or during the threat spike. But clearly, what needed to be done was that we needed systems in place that would bring all of this together. It is not enough to leave this to chance. If you look at this period, I think you see that everybody, the director of the CIA, Louis Freeh had left, but the key counterterrorism person was a part of Dick Clark's group and was meeting with him, and I'm sure shaking the trees and doing all of the things that you would want people to do. We were being given reports all the time that they were doing everything they could, but there was a systemic problem in getting that kind of shared intelligence. One of the first things that Bob Mueller did post 9/11 was to recognize that the issue of prevention meant that you had to break down some of the walls between criminal and counterterrorism, between criminal and intelligence. The way that we went about this was to have individual cases where you were trying to build a criminal case, individual offices with responsibility for those cases. Much was not coming to the FBI in a way that it could then engage the policymakers. So these were big structural reforms. We did some things to try and get the CIA reforming. We did some things to try and get a better sense of how to put all of this together. But structural reform is hard, and in 7 months, we didn't have time to make the changes that were necessary. We made them almost immediately after September 11th.
Well, would you consider the problem is solved today?
I would not consider the problem solved. I believe that we have made some very important structural changes. The creation of a Department of Homeland Security is an absolutely critical issue, because the Department of Homeland Security brings together INS and the Customs Department and the border people and all of the people who were scattered, Customs and Treasury and INS and Justice and so forth, brings them together in a way that a single secretary is looking after the homeland every day. He's looking at what infrastructure needs to be protected. He's looking at what state and local governments need to do their work. That is an extremely important innovation. I hope that he will have the freedom to manage that organization in a way that will make it fully effective, because there are a lot of issues for Congress in how that's managed. We have created a Threat Terrorism Information Center, the TTIC, which does bring together all of the sources of information from all of the intelligence agencies, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the INS and the CIA and the DIA, so that there's one place where all of this is coming together. And, of course, the Patriot Act, which permits the kind of sharing that we need between the CIA and the FBI, is also an important innovation. But I would be the first to tell you, I'm a student of institutional change. I know that you get few chances to make really transformative institutional change. And I think that when we've heard from this commission and from others who are working on other pieces of the problem, like, for instance, the issues of intelligence and weapons of mass destruction, that this president will be open to new ideas. I really don't believe that all of our work is done, despite the tremendous progress that we've made thus far.
Well, I promise you that we're going to respond to that, because that is really a problem that's bothering us, is that it doesn't appear to us, even with the changes up till now, that it's solved the institutional versus institutional issues, which then maybe it has, but you know, it's of grave concern to us. I would also ask, I don't want to take the time today, but I would ask that you provide our commission, if you would, with your analysis on the MI5 issue. As you know, it's something we're going to have to deal with, and we're taking all information aboard that we may. So we'd appreciate that if you could supply that to us.
I appreciate that. I want to be very clear. I think that we've made very important changes. I think that they are helping us tremendously. Every day now in the Oval Office in the morning, the FBI director and the CIA director sit with the president, sharing information in ways that they would have been prohibited to share that information before. So very important changes have taken place. We need to see them mature. We need to know how it's working, but we also have to be open to see what more needs to be done.
It may be solved at the top. We've got to make sure it's solved at the bottom.
I agree completely.
And kind of related to that, we've heard testimony, a great deal of it, about the coordination that took place during the Millennium Threat in 1999, where there were a series of principals meetings and a lot of activity, as we're told, which stopped and prevented incidents. It was a success. It was an intelligence success, and there had to be domestic coordination with foreign intelligence and everything. But it seemed to work. The time ended, the threat ended, and apparently the guard was let down a little too as the threat diminished. Now, we've also heard testimony about what we would call the summer threat, the spike threat, whatever it is, of 2001. A lot of chatter. You shared some of it with us directly. A lot of traffic and a lot of threats. And during that period, actually, to put it in context, I guess it was the first draft of the NSPD was circulated to deputies. But right then, when that was happening, the threats were coming in, and it's been described as a crescendo and hair on fire and all these different things. At that time, the CSG handled the alert, if you will. And we've heard testimony about Clark warning you and the NSC that state and CIA and the Pentagon had concerns, and were convinced there was going to be a major terrorist attack. And on July 5th, I believe it was, domestic agencies, including the FBI and the FAA, were briefed by the White House. Alerts were issued. The next day, the CIA told the CSG participants, and I think they said they believed their upcoming attack would be as spectacular, something quantitatively different from anything that had been done to date. So everybody was worried about it. Everybody was concentrating on it. And then later the crescendo ended, and again it abated. But of course, that time, the end of the story wasn't pleasant. Now, during this period of time, I'd like you to just respond to several points. What involvement did you have in this alert? And how did it come about that the CSG was handling this thing as opposed to the principals? Because candidly, it has been suggested that the difference between the 1999 handling and this one was that you didn't have the principals dealing with it, therefore it wasn't given the priority, therefore the people weren't forced to do what they would otherwise have done, et cetera. You've heard the same things I've heard. And would it have made a real difference in enhancing the exchange of intelligence, for instance, if it had been the principals? I would like your comments both on your involvement and your comment to that question. Thank you. Of course.
Let me start by talking about what we were doing in the structure we used. I've mentioned that the CSG, yes, was the counterterrorism group, was the nerve center, if you will. And that's been true through all crises. I think it was, in fact, a nerve center as well during the millennium, that they were the counterterrorism experts. They were able to get together. They got together frequently. They came up with taskings that needed to be done. I would say that if you look at the list of taskings that they came up with, it reflected the fact that the threat information was from abroad. It was that the agencies, like the Department of State, needed to make clear to Americans traveling abroad that there was a danger, that embassies needed to be on alert, that our force protection needed to be strong for our military forces. The Central Intelligence Agency was asked to do some things. It was very foreign policy or foreign threat-based as well. And of course, the warning to the FBI to go out and task their field agents. The CSG was made up of not junior people, but the top level of counterterrorism experts. Now, they were in contact with their principals. Dick Clark was in contact with me quite frequently during this period of time. When the CSG would meet, he would come back, usually through email, sometimes personally, and say, here's what we've done. I would talk every day, several times a day, with George Tenet about what the threat spike looked like. In fact, George Tenet was meeting with the president during this period of time, so the president was hearing directly about what was being done about the threats to the only really specific threats we had, to Genoa, to the Persian Gulf. There was one to Israel. So the president was hearing what was being done. The CSG was the nerve center. But I just don't believe that bringing the principals over to the White House every day and having their counterterrorism people have to come with them and be pulled away from what they were doing to disrupt was a good way to go about this. It wasn't an efficient way to go about it. I talked to Powell, I talked to Rumsfeld about what was happening with with the threats and with the alerts. I talked to George. I asked that the Attorney General be briefed because even though there were no domestic threats, I didn't want him to be without that briefing. It's also the case that I think if you actually look back at the Millennium period, it's questionable to me whether the argument that has been made that somehow shaking the trees is what broke up the Millennium period is actually accurate. And I was not there, clearly, but I will tell you this, I will say this, that the Millennium, of course, was a period of high threat by its very nature. We all knew that the Millennium was a period of high threat. And after September 11th, Dick Clark sent us the after-action report that had been done after the Millennium Plot. And their assessment was that Rassam had been caught by chance. Well, Rassam being the person who was entering the United States over the Canadian border with bomb-making materials in store. I think it actually wasn't by chance, which was Washington's view of it. It was because a very alert customs agent named Diana Dean and her colleagues sniffed something about Rassam. They saw that something was wrong. They tried to apprehend him. He tried to run. They then apprehended him, found that there was bomb-making material and a map of Los Angeles. Now, at that point, you have pretty clear indication that you've got a problem inside the United States. I don't think it was shaking the trees that produced the breakthrough in the Millennium Plot. It was that you got a, Dick Clark would say a lucky break. I would say you got an alert customs agent who got it right. And the interesting thing is that I've checked with customs, and according to their records, they weren't actually on alert at that point. So I just don't buy the argument that we weren't shaking the trees enough and that something was going to fall out that gave us somehow that little piece of information that would have led to connecting all of those dots. In any case, you cannot be dependent on the chance that something might come together. That's why the structural reforms are important. And the President of the United States had us at battle stations during this period of time. He expected his Secretary of State to be locking down embassies. He expected his Secretary of Defense to be providing force protection. He expected his FBI director to be tasking his agents and getting people out there. He expected his Director of Central Intelligence to be out and doing what needed to be done in terms of disruption. And he expected his National Security Advisor to be looking to see that, or talking to people to see that that was done. But I think we've created a kind of false impression, or a not quite correct impression of how one does this in a threat period. I might just add that during the China period, the 11 days of the China crisis, I also didn't have a principals meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.